At a dawn service at Anzac Cove in the late 1990s, an Australian Commonwealth War Graves Commissioner was speaking at the podium, muffled in a dark coat against the morning chill, when suddenly he was heckled by someone in the crowd who yelled out, "Who's the bloody priest?" The affronted commissioner, who incidentally was not a priest, but as a distinguished soldier and academic, recalled that he was initially angry, until he realised that the first Anzacs were the same age as his heckler, and many of them would have had the same irreverent sentiments. Well, the commissioner was accurate on one count. The first Anzacs were not short of irreverent sentiments. But he was surely mistaken on another. Great war soldiers would not have been surprised at all to have seen a priest, usually in the form of a chaplain, leading war commemoration. Clergy, primarily in the form of chaplains, have always played an integral role in the commemoration of Australian war, not least on Anzac Day. Nevertheless, this questioning in the late 1990s of priestly leadership at an Anzac Cove dawn service suggests a shift in community attitudes and expectations about the role of religious leaders and perhaps religion itself in Anzac Day commemoration. Historian Ken Inglis was the first to highlight the importance of the religious dimensions of Anzac Day in two seminal essays in 1965, and one of these, by the way, in our St. Mark's Review. Inglis mused on the temples of the Anzac spirit, these monuments to the dead warriors, and the complex relation between their custodians and the bearers of the tradition of Christian worship. Inglis identified growing tensions between the RSL and church leaders by 1965. Yet 50 years on from Inglis's reflections, only a handful of scholars have considered such questions, despite the remarkable expansion since the 1980s of the Anzac legend or myth and its commemoration in the national psyche. This, of course, has been nurtured by a blossoming Australian nationalism, guided by political leaders, but rooted in popular cultural representations of Australian history. Historian Mark McKenna recently issued a call for historians to understand why 25th of April has become holier than the 25th of December in the Australian calendar. Well, several questions about the changing and complex relationship between war, memory, and religion remain pertinent. And these are the focus of my lecture tonight. In the first place, what role have Christian ritual, imagery, and personnel played during a century of Anzac Day commemoration? In the first part of this lecture, I'll chart that changing role, noting important shifts in the years before 1965. I'll then consider developments after 1965, and particularly since the 1990s. But a second set of questions concern the extent to which Anzac Day should be described as an alternative religion or civil religion. If Anzac Day and its mythology are components of an Australian civil religion, as I'm going to argue in the second part of this lecture, what relation does this civil religion have to the Christian religion in Australia? A related question, perhaps more complex, concerns what relation this civil religion should have. These are not easy questions to answer, but a historical understanding of the changing practices and contexts of commemoration can help us in the task of remembering rightly. Well, let me begin by sketching the relationship between Christianity and Anzac Day before the momentous changes of the 1960s. Historically, chaplains have been the most important religious custodians of war commemoration in Australia. Several thousand have served Australian servicemen and women over the last century. In the army alone, 414 chaplains served in the Great War, 751 in the Second World War. They represent Australia's largest and most ecumenical mobilisation of Australian religious leaders, but it's only recently that they've attracted a full-scale modern study in the shape of my recent book, Captains of the Soul. Among my findings in that book was that chaplains played an integral role in commemoration of the war. Of most importance is Anglican chaplain David Garlin's role as the architect of Anzac Day commemoration and its public character. And I should note that anyone interested in the origins and early history of Anzac Day should consult the definitive account, John Moses's Anzac Day Origins, Before, when I was introduced, Andrew mentioned that I had done groundbreaking work on the origins. I have to say that it's John Moses who's done this groundbreaking work. I merely stand on the shoulders of giants here tonight. I know he's here and he'd be happy to sign his book, which is on sale at the back desk later tonight. Well, David Garlin organised the first Anzac Day commemoration in Brisbane during 1916. His influence, imbued by his Anglo-Catholic theology, his Irish experience of Orangemen marches, his desire for non-sectarian, inclusive ritual, is indelibly stamped on Anzac Day commemoration. In special church services, in the early Anzac ceremonies and badges, which he devised, in the march past and silent reflection, in the solemn wreath-laying ceremonies at memorials, and in the returned soldiers' luncheon. Well, what were the original intentions of Anzac Day? Garland wanted a solemn public holiday, insisting that Anzac Day ought to be Australia's All Souls' Day, but not supported by just one church or faith. All Souls' Day here refers to the day in the church calendar following Halloween, in which Christians traditionally remembered the departed. The denominational pluralism of Australia demanded commemoration that took account of the non-negotiable theological differences among the churches, as well as the agnosticism in the wider population. The main issues were first, praying for the dead, which Protestants and many Anglicans could not endorse, and second, that Roman Catholics would not pray together with so-called non-Catholics. Consequently, the public liturgy of commemoration had to be a non-denominational requiem that satisfied the public need to acknowledge the sacrifice of Australians in war, to mourn the dead, and to console the bereaved. In addition, it was to be a national call to repentance for the sin of war, and thereby a means of reviving religious fervour in the community. The original Anzac Day was to be solemn, like the Requiem Mass of the Anglican, Roman Catholic and Orthodox traditions, essentially resembling the mood of Good Friday, whose observance was recognised and respected across the nation at this stage. Well, the pattern began in Brisbane and was adapted by each state, then by federal parliament, who legislated in 1930 that the 25th of April would be marked throughout the nation as Anzac Day. Garland's service and forms were adopted across the nation, becoming the mainstay of Anzac commemoration to this day. Well, despite these efforts, commemoration did not remain immune to the bitter sectarianism that blighted interwar Australian society. These years were the high point, or perhaps we should say the low point, of rivalries between Irish Catholics on one hand, English Anglicans and Scots-Irish Presbyterians on the other. These were the days when proddy dogs traded insults with tykes or rock choppers, and when, as Patrick O'Farrell pithily put it, the Irish banded together to defend themselves against the charge that they tend to band together. Well, the major problem for Catholics was the fact that they were forbidden on theological and canon law grounds from attendance at any religious service other than their own, on the ground that this would appear to validate non-Catholic ordinations. The result was that they boycotted the United services, instead peeling off during marches to attend a separate high mass for the fallen. It was not until the 1960s that Norman Gilroy, an Irenic Catholic cardinal, Gallipoli veteran and Australian patriot, found a way to bridge the sectarian impasse and allow Catholics to attend Anzac Day services. His condition was that prayers be read by a layman and that the clergy's address not be a sermon, but rather a patriotic address. Catholic and Protestant clergy stood on the dais in the Domain together for the first time on Anzac Day in 1962 before a crowd of 20,000. This pattern of lay-led services with patriotic addresses from religious leaders has persisted in Sydney and other capital cities since the 1960s. But religious tensions regarding Anzac Day have not always been sectarian. Churches encountered conflict with the Anzac Day Commemoration Councils and the RSL. In 1938, the Melbourne Commemoration Council provoked the ire of Anglican clergy, for whom many of the prominent spokesmen were former chaplains, by replacing the united service with a civic ceremony at the Shrine of Remembrance. Anglican Archbishop Frederick Head boycotted the service. General Sir Harry Chauvel, one of Australia's leading soldiers, boycotted the march. Still, Catholic Archbishop Daniel Mannix couldn't restrain his dark Irish wit, remarking that Australian soldiers often had to go over the top without their leaders. Well, a sharper controversy erupted in Sydney in 1965 when the Jubilee commemoration of Anzac Day fell on a Sunday. The RSL had traditionally accommodated churches on such Sundays by pushing the march later into the afternoon. But this time the RSL refused, scheduled the march for 9 a.m, provoking the declaration of prominent Methodist minister and founder of Lifeline, Alan Walker, that this presented Australians with a sharp choice between pagan worship of the state and its traditions and the worship of God. William Yeo, the RSL president, retorted that Anzac Day was bigger than churches or individuals and held firm. Supporters of the RSL's stance attacked Walker's well-known pacifism and suggested that fighting for religious freedom and the spirit of sacrifice reflected a truer Christian spirit. Well, debates in the press turned on competing definitions of what constituted a Christian and a pagan. Clergymen thought of paganism as akin to religion like that of ancient Greece or Rome, having as its objects the civic community and the dead warrior. RSL supporters took it to mean something like hedonism or immorality. One Second World War veteran observed of this stoush that it exhibited, and I quote, "a trend which is becoming increasingly evident in the RSL to de-Christianise Anzac celebrations and to replace worship of God alone with a new reverence for the spirit of our departed comrades. If this trend continues, a new religion of ancestor worship could develop, complete with ritual, songs of which are already in evidence in some gatherings." Well, 50 years on from 1965, we might well ask whether this prediction proved accurate. By that year, the Gordian knot of sectarianism and Anzac Day had clearly been cut, but to what extent did Anzac Day become de-Christianised in the ensuing decades? And what have Christian leaders and thinkers made of these changes? Well, in the first place, the debates before 1965 point to another perennial tension regarding the character of Anzac Day, namely whether it should be classified a solemn fast or a feast, a commemoration or a celebration. Well, the reality is that both conceptions of Anzac Day have always existed side by side. Since 1965, the solemnity in the sense of the sacred, the fast, has been increasingly reserved for the dawn service, while the feast has been reserved for the after-party of the march and post-march celebrations in public games of two-up, major sporting fixtures and the pubs. A minority of radicals and pacifists occasionally used the day as a site of protest. Many, of course, abstained from marking it altogether. In the decades after 1965, both churches and the RSL were beset by concerns that they were out of touch with the younger generation. Churches noticed declining membership, especially among youth, while the RSL contended with a radicalised Vietnam War generation who protested against selective conscription and criticised Anzac Day as an outdated form of militaristic nationalism that smacked of chauvinism, racism and anachronism. Alan Seymour's play, The One Day of the Year, most famously captures this mood. Well, much to its critics' surprise, and many historians' surprise, Anzac Day rebounded in the 1980s on the back of a worldwide memory boom and in an Australian climate of growing nationalist sentiment and introspection. After 1990, Anzac Day commemoration attracted political patronage, and the Anzac Legend was repackaged without its earlier racial, martial and imperial overtones as a protean story of national genesis that could flexibly accommodate a wide spectrum of Australians, those wishing to affirm universal values such as courage, comradeship and sacrifice, or the left's cherished values of egalitarianism, suspicion of authority, larrikinism, even tolerance and diversity. And, on the right, conservatives' concern for loyalty, respect for tradition and pride in our British heritage. Political leaders have also invoked its language to promote social cohesion in an increasingly multicultural and multi-ethnic society. Well, where has this push for an ever more inclusive narrative left the religious custodians of Anzac Day commemoration in the decades since 1965? Preparations surrounding the entombment of the unknown soldier at the Australian War Memorial on Remembrance Day in 1993 provide a revealing case study of mounting pressures on Christian leaders to fashion a more inclusive and less distinctively Christian liturgy. The final service was crafted by the heads of chaplaincy and included elements such as Psalm 23, of course the common property of both Christian and Jew, and a Catholic chaplain leading the prayers. But the concern to uphold a multicultural consensus was evident in the invocation of the God of the dream time during prayers, and the decision that during the ceremony the soldier would lie in state in Old Parliament House, rather than in the Christian Changi Chapel at RMC Duntroon. Nevertheless, chaplains still played a prominent role in proceedings, both on the day and as religious subject matter experts, advising on proper forms and liturgy. While the explicitly Christian forms were diluted, the War Memorial was still requesting prayers based on a hope for an afterlife and the existence of God. In the 2 decades since 1993, chaplains have remained integral to the conduct of Anzac Day commemoration, especially at the unit level and among veterans. In these grassroots contexts, it's also retained Orthodox Christian theology and denominational nuances. A similarly robust Christian temper is apparent in both Anglican and Uniting Church liturgies that were fashioned in the mid-1990s. Both retain distinctly Trinitarian references in relation to war commemoration. An equally interesting picture emerges if we probe Chaplains' involvement since the late 1990s in one of the fastest growing and most symbolically important Anzac Day services, the dawn service at the Australian War Memorial. Chaplains have maintained an important presence and ceremonial role. In addition, they've delivered the majority of addresses. Well, I've analysed these addresses, and a striking feature of many of them is engagement with explicitly Christian themes, despite being delivered to audiences of many faiths and none that have grown steadily from around 6,000 in 1993 to 128,000 last year. That said, not all have incorporated Christian motifs or messages. The 2001 dawn service address, offered by a New Zealand Navy chaplain, made no mention of anything remotely Christian, prompting the complaints of Doug Hind that the address was an appeal which used a least common denominator religious, spiritual language, stripped largely of its specificity and its challenge, and stripped of the elements of the judgment and hope and reconciliation that are all inescapably part of the Christian story. Well, Christian themes have remained embedded in the liturgical setting for the addresses. The 2014 dawn service, for example, contained the Lord's Prayer and one of the small repertoire of hymns that has been sung on Anzac Days for a century. Abide with me, for example, replete with the line, hold thou thy cross before my closing eyes. The other hymns, O God, our help in ages past, and O valiant hearts, are more suited to a broad-based monotheism, as is the Anzac dedication, led by a chaplain, which seeks God's help for giving one's utmost. Now, what audiences make of these dawn services is another matter altogether, and beyond the scope, of course, of this lecture. It's apparent that very few people know the words to the hymns. I was there last year at the dawn service at the War Memorial, and almost no one, I could hear one person around me singing, despite 128,000 people being there. In many ways, this is a reflection of the widespread decline since the 1960s of both church-going and communal singing traditions in Australia. And likewise, my small, albeit significant, sample cautions against pressing claims for a Christian Anzac Day too far. But taken together, this suggests a more persistent Christian cast on National Anzac Day commemoration than many historians and commentators have allowed. Well, it's clear that despite changes in the religious complexion of Australian society since the 1960s, Anzac Day services can still retain a significant Christian component in terms of substance, liturgical shape, and personnel. Yet we've also seen counter-evidence of a watering down of specifically Christian themes in patriotic rather than Christian addresses as the price of ecumenical unity, in the 1993 entombment of the unknown soldier, and in at least some prominent dawn service addresses, where a bland, lowest common denominator spirituality is the message of the day. But the ambiguity and absence of Christian themes is also strikingly evident in much of the architecture and monuments of commemoration, the sacred places on the Australian landscape where people gather for Anzac Day commemoration. Many rely on classical pagan forms and symbols, such as obelisks, statues, or war trophies, or they reflect the secular trends of the time, not least Art Deco. When biblical texts are inscribed on war memorials, they're usually phrases or statements considered acceptable and non-offensive in a secular context. The most ubiquitous is John 15:13, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." Yet this is often shortened to "greater love hath no man," which is ambiguous enough to leave the reader to determine for whom or what the sacrifice was made. The reference to John's Gospel is often omitted, further detaching the text from its biblical context and transforming it into a moral ideal that was common cultural property and not theologically offensive. Well, one of the most conspicuous examples is the Melbourne Shrine of Remembrance, opened in 1934 and based on the 4th century mausoleum at Halicarnassus, just down the coast from Gallipoli. The marble stone at centre has the inscription, "Greater love hath no man," the only Bible text. But this is surrounded by a curious blend of classical pagan architecture with several messages inscribed on the walls. Moreover, the truncated Bible text does not point to Christ as the ideal of the text, but to those who sacrificed for Australia. Closer to home, as Jane earlier pointed out, the Australian War Memorial is modelled on a stylised Byzantine cathedral with its crucifix shape and dome. The Byzantine, of course, is ecumenical, gesturing towards a period that predates divisions between Protestant, Roman Catholic and Orthodox. But the only allusion to Christianity inside the War Memorial appears in a stained glass window labelled Ancestry, where, accompanying cricket stumps and other objects, is a church spire. The official description tells us that this represents the European tradition of Christianity, a phrase signalling a civilization as much as a religion. Well, this mixture of classical virtues and Christian values is also on display in the much-discussed Anzac legend or myth, which over the last 30 years has become etched into the collective national psyche. The Anzac Legend, of course, has its roots in the historic Gallipoli campaign with its 8,000 Australian deaths and numerous acts of bravery, sacrifice and mateship. Well, these produced a powerful and widely accepted legend or myth that the events at Gallipoli somehow forged a nation, representing Australia's baptism of fire and its spiritual birth as a nation, and enshrining the character qualities of Anzac soldiers in the national character, such as unpretentious courage, self-sacrifice in the midst of suffering, initiative, and of course, mateship. Well, in more recent years, the Anzac legend and its rituals of commemoration have been helpfully conceptualised by scholars in terms of civil religion. It's a concept with a long pedigree that dates back to Plato's Laws and the first 4 books of Augustine's City of God. Its best known modern formulation is that of Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his Social Contract of 1762. Rousseau envisioned civil religion as a sort of moral glue for the body politic, created by the social contract. It was the general will of the people expressed religiously in the life of the state, with a benign deistic God presiding over the public faith and seeing that it was properly kept. Well, modern definitions of civil religion, which have proliferated since the 1960s in the work of sociologist Robert Bellah, have tended to cluster around the following constellation of ideas. So civil religion refers to the way in which a particular set of political or social arrangements come to acquire an aura of the sacred, thereby elevating their stature and enhancing their stability. They can serve as a point of reference for the shared faith of the entire state or nation, focusing on the most generalised and widely held beliefs about the history and destiny of that nation. It's rarely entirely spontaneous or entirely invented, and is more likely some combination of the two. But it plays an important role in social cohesion, providing much of the social glue that binds together a society through well-established rituals, celebrations, places, and values, endowing the society with an overarching sense of spiritual unity, a sacred canopy, as Peter Berger put it, and a focal point for shared memories of struggle and survival. Although it borrows extensively from the society's dominant religious tradition, it is not itself a highly particularised religion, but instead a somewhat blandly inclusive one, into whose highly general stories and propositions those of various faiths can read and project what they wish. It is, so to speak, a highest common denominator. Well, numerous scholars, ranging from John Moses to Ken Inglis, have shown how Anzac commemoration qualifies as a civil religion. As Inglis points out, we see in Australia a landscape occupied by monuments which are fairly well cherished, which make solemn collective statements about war, death and nationality, and at which people, lately more and more people, choose to gather on at least one day of the year for the conduct of activities properly called religious. Robert Linder, a scholar of both American and Australian civil religion, agrees that Gallipoli has been mythologised in a civil religious manner to make it one of the great creative traditions of the Australian people. Unpretentious courage inspired mateship and sacrifice in the midst of inexplicable hardship and suffering. The Anzac tradition, adds Linder, comes closest of any element in modern Australian national life to providing universally recognised symbols and rituals to enshrine the transcendent elements of the nation's historical experience. Well, other scholars have noted the persistence of civil religions in modern secular states. This has been identified with the failure of secular society, with its mass forms of rationality, to satisfy fully its citizens' desires for meaningful community. In a pluralistic society, citizens tend to find meaningful community in their particular ethnic and religious and social communities, but not necessarily in their political community. This produces a crisis in citizenship that in turn produces a crisis of political unity. Secular society has difficulty expressing political unity in terms other than utility, and this inspires attempts to articulate political unity in non-utilitarian terms. Civil religion is a major example of such an attempt. So civil religion is useful to any society in terms of providing sanction for temporal authority, in defining and defending norms of public morality, in serving as a bulwark against anarchy, and in providing the indispensable cement of the social order. But as scholars have pointed out, there are dangers as well. And here Linder and others have helpfully nuanced the concept of civil religion by distinguishing two forms. The first is a prophetic form of civil religion, where the people and their political leaders are held accountable to a higher power, which may be called God, the Almighty, Providence, or some such name. On this view, the country's political and religious leaders normally tried to avoid nationalistic idolatry and sometimes call the people to repentance for national sins. I think that it's along these lines that Garlin fashioned the first Anzac Day service, remembering that the original aim for that service was the public need to acknowledge the sacrifice of Australians in war, to mourn the dead, to console the bereaved, but it was also a national call to repentance for the sin of war. Well, the second form of civil religion is priestly civil religion, where the concept of accountability is not stressed, the interests of the nation or state become the ultimate test of what is right and good. The country's political and religious leaders frequently affirm and celebrate the nation, glorify the culture, and stroke the people. In sum, the prophetic form usually serves as a restraining influence on the activities of the nation and state, while the priestly form often sanctions national actions or foreign policy. If we are to remember rightly, then I think we do well to keep this understanding of different types of civil religion in mind. While an Australian Christian may legitimately embrace aspects of the civil religion, of which Anzac is the high feast day, the embrace should always be critical, and with an insistence that the civil religion wear a prophetic slip rather than a priestly one. This is because Christianity, of course, from its inception, has insisted upon separating the claims of Caesar and the claims of God, recognising the legitimacy of both, but placing loyalty to God above loyalty to the state. This, incidentally, is why Rousseau thought Christianity a lousy candidate for civil religion. The Christian is to be in the world, but not of the world, of course. And as Augustine put it, the Christian lives as a law-abiding citizen in the city of man, while reserving ultimate loyalty for the city of God. It was this separation and hierarchy of loyalties that sundered the unity of the classical world and had the effect of marking out a distinctly secular realm, although at the same time confining its claims. That said, the boundaries between the secular and religious realms are never neatly fixed, and their relationship evolves out of a process of constant negotiation and renegotiation, responsive to the changing needs of the culture and the moment. This is a proposition that committed religious believers and secularists alike find worrisome. And Australia is, of course, going through such a process at present, not least in the contested status of the institution of marriage, which has always been both a civil and a religious institution. Well, this perpetual tension helps to explain why Christian leaders and thinkers have sometimes been uneasy about the Anzac civil religion, not least the ways in which the liturgy of Anzac Day might seem to enlist Christianity into the service of the state. There's also the risk of diluting vital religious faith when it identifies God with the national destiny and in essence reduces the universal God of the Bible to the tribal God of a certain country. We know from history, especially from that of the Great War, how different sides in war have tended to appropriate God to their narrow nationalist causes. As the despairing rhyme of Great War poet J.C. Squire pointed out, and I quote, "God heard the embattled nations sing and shout, God strafe England and God save the king, God this, God that, and God the other thing. Good God, said God, I've got my work cut out." Well, a critical posture towards commemoration is therefore crucial for both the Christian and, I would argue, for the historian. Just as transcendent values are essential for civil religion if it's to remain prophetic and thereby restrained from degenerating into a priestly civil religion that merely provides ceremonial sanction for the state and its decisions. We may rightly question, for example, a leader's invocation of the Anzac myth in justifications for military intervention, witness John Howard and the Second Gulf War in Iraq. Or we might justly question the federal government's spending allocation for commemoration of the Great War Centenary, which as of January this year is $331 million, an amount far exceeding that of all major combatant nations. By comparison, Great Britain has allocated $110 million, France $90 million, and Germany $6 million. Add to federal government spending the contributions of $140 million from the states and territories and $90 million from the private sector, and the total Australian spend on Great War Centenary is $562 million. We might also compare our government's allocation of $470 million for commemoration against its drastic spending cuts on foreign aid. The Lowy Institute notes that this will see Australian aid fall to 0.22% of gross national income in 2017, the lowest level in Australian history. Well, several Australian historians and thinkers have, I think, legitimately questioned the notion that Gallipoli or the Great War represent the birth of the nation, as opposed to the Federation of Australia in 1901. They've proposed that different traditions of social and political innovation should also remain in the public memory, such as the secret ballot, women's suffrage, the living wage, or the 8-hour day. Values such as mateship also appear to predate the war in the camaraderie generated by the common hardships of convict life, or in the levelling egalitarian collectivism that was forged by the isolation and hardships of the Australian bush. Some historians have observed the marginalisation of Australia's women and Indigenous peoples from the Anzac founding narrative, while noting little acknowledgement of frontier warfare with Indigenous peoples in our commemoration of war. Historians have also lamented a vacuous sentimental nationalism, in addition to what they describe as the militarisation of Australian history further propagated by lavish government funding of Anzac-related school curricula and resources that sing in a conservative key. Our poets have also put this plea none more succinctly than Les Murray. The day of our peace will need a native herb that outsavours rosemary. Now, not all historians have agreed with such positions. Ken Inglis, for example, has contested the top-down explanation of the resurgence of Anzac, noting significant popular interest and enthusiasm at the grassroots, while others have contested the way in which school teachers and students seem to be presented as passive recipients. Well, similarly, a vigorous contest ensues among historians about the meaning and origins of the war. That continues unabated, with interpretations polarising between, on the one side, insistence on German culpability and noble purpose in the war, a view defended most eloquently in Australia by John Moses, but on the other side, insistence on collective responsibility against a background of ethnic and nationalistic ferment in Europe, perhaps most prominently defended by Australian historian Christopher Clark. The outbreak of war, writes Clark, is not an Agatha Christie drama at the end of which we'll discover the culprit standing over a corpse in the conservatory with a smoking pistol. Clark instead sees smoking pistols in many hands. But my point is this: these debates among historians are not closed, and that is as it should be. Jane pointed to the vocation of the theologian as truth-telling, and I think that's also the vocation of the historian. Truth-telling and robust debate should always be the case among historians. The evidence on both sides should be weighed up. But one problem with public discourse in relation to commemoration or a civil religion is that its sacred aura encourages some of its defenders to resist unpalatable insights and to resent inconvenient truths. As one prominent commentator has pointed out recently, those who appear to question Anzac Day with the best of intentions are subject to recrimination. Merely asking questions is to be guilty of crass impertinence and crude blasphemy, tantamount to traducing Australia's national identity or undermining a necessary pillar of social order. To ensure the cohesive meta-narrative remains intact, critics are treated as outcasts and banished from the public square, so their voice will never again tarnish Australian icons. Now, this might seem surprising for a society that claims to abhor intolerance and close-mindedness. Yet contrasting views need to be aired if societies like Australia are to avoid the groupthink that blighted Germany and Japan in the 1930s, or Russia and China in the 1950s. And here we might wonder whether commemoration is essentially about how we would prefer to remember the past, rather than a heartfelt desire to understand the past with all its complexities and conundrums. Well, additionally, as we've seen, the public cult of Anzac can garble the Christian gospel and render it ambiguous. Greater love hath no man, declare the war memorials, but the original meaning of the text is lost when wrenched from the context of Jesus' anticipation of his coming passion. We've also noted Christian leaders' concerns about ancestor worship. Well, Christian leaders have also been concerned about the pagan classical spirit and character of many commemorative shrines. Now here, Edwin Judge, one of Australia's foremost ancient historians and classicists, detects a dynamic and often hidden tension in the Western mind between, on the one hand, the classical world's four cardinal virtues, embodied in the courage, moderation, prudence, and justice of Stoicism, and on the other hand, the Pauline trio of abiding attitudes from 1 Corinthians 13, which Judge translates as trust, hope, and care. Well, in Roman times, Stoics trained students to strive for apathy, literally impassivity and unresponsiveness. In particular, pity was seen as a vice of the soul in the same way cruelty was. In either case, one risked being emotionally engulfed by another person. One should not bother sharing another's suffering, since they presumably deserved it, as the Neoplatonist Plotinus was to explain it. In contrast, the Christian concept of care, from the Greek agape, the Latin caritas, offered a radical alternative to classical ethics, one that was essentially self-sacrificing and relational. Greater love has no man. In later centuries, after the West was won by Christianity, the Cardinal Four and the Pauline Trio were conflated into a canon of 7 Christian virtues. But the predominant imprint is that of biblical culture, which has absorbed classical values so comfortably that the inherent contradictions are not registered. But everyone in the modern West embodies them inarticulately. This hidden tension drives Western dynamism, but it also explains the inability of politicians and educators to state plainly what the national values are. And I think this tension also helps to explain the seemingly bipolar character of Australian war commemoration, with its juxtaposition of classical and biblical themes and motifs. This was brought home to me this morning on reading Brendan Nelson's Anzac Day speech delivered at the War Memorial yesterday. He pointed his audience to the stained glass windows in the Hall of Memory, which we noted earlier in this lecture. To young Australians, Nelson declared, "Your search for belonging, meaning, and values for the world you want ends here." Enshrined in stained glass windows, standing sentinel above the tomb of the unknown Australian soldier, are 15 values informing character, said Nelson, and he quoted them: resource, candour, devotion, curiosity, independence, comradeship, ancestry, patriotism, chivalry, loyalty, coolness, control, audacity, endurance, and decision. It'd be hard to find a more succinct statement of the classical virtues. But a little later in his speech, Nelson adds that this place, this day, is not about war. It is about love and friendship. Well, if commemoration is about love and friendship, as well as the classical virtues, then clearly the Anzac civil religion still needs its Christian inheritance. One of our own resident theologians, Stephen Pickard, has likewise meditated on the Hall of Memory and the way it extols those great virtues of the Stoic spirit, which he calls the default practical philosophy for those of Anglo-Saxon roots. For Pickard, the inscription of "No greater love" on war monuments represents nothing less than the Jesus tradition subsumed into Stoicism. Stoicism, argues Pickard, is indeed a brilliant alternative to the Christian faith and a powerful philosophy for waging and enduring war. But can it, he asks, and I quote, "go far enough for a full human life?" That is a question that ought to haunt us, who are overwhelmed by the brutalities of human life on so many fronts, and yet in the next breath, taken to the heights of joy and exuberant hope in the face of remarkable human feats and acts of compassion. Tears and laughter are defining features of Homo sapiens. They are litmus tests for our full humanity. They embody the extremities of life and encompass everything in between. Stoic, heroic sacrifice refuses such movement in the human spirit. End quote. Well, Pickard's observation points again to the reliance of commemoration on the Christian inheritance, the values of compassion and self-sacrificial love. Parche Brendan Nelson, perhaps it is here where young Australians' search for belonging, meaning, and values ends. Pathos, then, has its place. And surely our war commemoration should be free to rejoice in the face of remarkable human feats and acts of compassion. But surely the commemoration of war is also one place where we need to be free to weep and to lament, as we remember the brutalities and the hideous human cost of war. This will always be the case, even though we are now no longer in living memory of the Great War and the immense grief it unleashed. On Anzac Day, we remember the fallen, but as Tom Frame has pointed out, we also remember the fallenness of humankind, with the realization that men and women have deep within their own being the seeds of humanity's destruction. Anzac Day leaves no room for optimism about the human condition. This is not to contend that armed conflict cannot be justified. Sometimes physical force is necessary and unavoidable if tyranny and evil are to be restrained. But the causes of human conflict stalk the human heart. It is only the consequences that can better be mediated. We weep then, not for our war dead and the past, but for ourselves and the present. Despite our commitment to remember on the 25th of April each year, the abolition of armed conflict remains a work in progress. Well, finally, we've considered plenty of challenges to Christianity in this lecture. But the kind of commemoration that frame gestures towards offers possible opportunities that Anzac Day commemoration might provide for Australian Christians. Anglican Bishop to the Australian Defence Force, Ian Lambert, observed recently that in contemporary Anzac commemoration, Australians are trying to articulate, I quote, what we stand for and presumably what we would die for. In the 21st century, the civil religious aspects of Anzac Day point to a deeper quest about identity and a mostly unacknowledged need to connect with the numinous. Lambert added that when Australians gather at the Town War Memorial, there is a permissive and open attitude towards prayer and the divine, which would not normally feature as part of their expression. They are using the national remembrance of our fallen soldiers, sailors, and airmen as a vehicle for their own spiritual quest. This posture, as well as the persistence of civil religion in modern secular societies, fits with what philosopher Charles Taylor describes as a sense and longing for the transcendent that will not easily be uprooted from the human heart. I think Taylor names and identifies what some of our best novelists, poets, and artists attest to, that our age is haunted. On the one hand, we live under a brass heaven, ensconced in immanence. We live in the twilight of both gods and idols. But their ghosts have refused to depart. And every once in a while, we might be surprised to find ourselves tempted by belief, by intimations of transcendence. Even what Taylor calls the immanent frame of secular society is haunted. What's helpful about Taylor's analysis is that he gives us words to name what some Australians have felt rather than just what they've thought. And here, I think, is why Anzac Day commemoration is an important space, a space in which a collective secular Australia is haunted by the sacred. It's in such a space that Army Chaplain Andrew Gills has recently suggested the need to locate points of cultural connection between the Anzac legend and the Christian faith, namely by explaining how the ignominious defeat of the Gallipoli campaign, which Australians understand as symbolising something far greater, points to a far greater defeat that stands at the epicentre of human history, the death of Jesus Christ. Well, to conclude, Christianity has remained integral to Anzac Day commemoration during its first century, whether directly involved in the creation of its distinctive ritual and forms, in leadership at its actual ceremonies, or in debating whether its proper form and function should be as a fast or a feast. Christians have advocated the day's solemnity as well as the impropriety of sectarian division on a day of such importance. They've envisioned the civil religious dimensions of Anzac Day and the Anzac Legend as both challenge and opportunity. On the one hand, a challenge to Australia's deeper Christian underpinnings and identity, especially given Anzac Day's hybrid religiosity that is sometimes bordered on ancestor worship, pagan stoicism, or an inarticulate fumbling towards the transcendent. But on the other hand, Australian Christians have sensed an opportunity to relocate points of cultural connection between the Anzac legend, the Christian faith, and the spiritual aspirations of Australians who live in a secular world that is nevertheless haunted by the transcendent. As a Christian, a historian, and an Australian, I'm convinced of the need to engage respectfully but critically with Anzac Day and war commemoration. I think we need to remember, but for carefully considered reasons. We may hold that some wars are just and necessary, we may not. But we should never forget the tragedy and the terrible human cost of war, the cost of which reverberates down the generations, and which I've also witnessed firsthand in my own family history. I think the final fitting response is prayer. And it's here that I'm grateful for my own tradition, which gives us clues about how we might approach Anzac Day and the commemoration of war. In the Anglican prayer book, sorry, not the Anzac prayer book, Freudian slip, I quote, "We give thanks for the freedoms we enjoy in this land and for those who laid down their lives to defend them. We pray also that the God of the nations, whose sovereign rule brings justice and peace, would have mercy on our broken and divided world, shed abroad his peace in the hearts of all, and banish from them the spirit that makes for war, that all races and people may learn to live as members of one family and in obedience to his law through his Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord." Thank you.